This is such an honor. Your Excellencies, honorable members of Parliament, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, honestly, words cannot begin to describe exactly how I feel today. And for those who know me, they know that I'm so rarely speechless. So this is a pleasure, and to be here among friends, both the friends that I have known for quite a while now, working in the trenches of the pro-life movement, as well as new friends that I have been making in the past few days. This has been really such a delight for me. Now, as I was walking up, I don't know how many of you noticed the music. I would have liked it to play a bit more to share it with you. It is an African tune. It's Unkomboti. If I was to pronounce it in the language, in the South African Xhosa language that it came in, honestly, I will be tongue-tied. So, but anyway, that particular song was very much a part of my childhood. I asked specifically for it to be like an opening song for this particular speech tonight, because it was really very much a part of my life growing up. It was a 1988 single that was a hit. And I grew up in Nigeria, in the southeastern part of Nigeria. I was one of 6 children. And if you're one of 6 children and you're living in a ghetto where everybody has an average of 7 children, so my parents were kind of planning it, you know that birthdays will be what we did all the time. So I went from one birthday party to another as an 8-year-old child when this music came out, and it played every day and everywhere and at every wedding of all our aunties and all our uncles. But anyway, I got tired of this music, right? Because they force you to dance to it, okay? And got tired of it, and it kind of passed as trends happen. But the next time I encountered this music was actually in 2005, when I was then sitting in my home. Then I was still living in Nigeria, in a city called Enugu. And I was watching a movie. And the movie started off set in a very beautiful countryside, an African countryside. And I didn't even have the presence of mind to know what to expect from this movie, but I just heard this song again, and I was so excited. Oh my goodness, this is 1988 again. And I jumped up and I started dancing, right? And after a few minutes, the first scene passed, and I had to get back into the movie, as all movie people who love movies. But as I sat down and started watching this film, my spirit fell. Something I started in such high spirits, something that took me back to my childhood. My spirit fell, because the content was shocking. And by the time this film ended, after about 2 hours, honestly, I found myself crouched on the floor, and I was weeping. This movie was Hotel Rwanda. Many of you might have watched it. It was a Hollywood hit. Made millions of dollars. Very touching story. Very good actors. So much about it was great. But why was I crouched on the floor, weeping again like an 8-year-old child? It was because I realized while watching this movie that it was more than a Hollywood tale. It happened. And I asked myself while watching this movie, how could we have missed it? The movie, for those of you who haven't seen it, it's the true life story of a man called Paul Rusesabagina, a Rwandan man who was a manager at a hotel. And then in 1994, in April of 94, the Rwandan genocide started almost without warning. Now, this man was a hotel manager, and in his hotel, he managed to shelter about 1,200 people. And the genocide kicked off, lasted 100 days, 100 days, all the way to July. And people were killed in this beautiful African country, in this peaceful, otherwise African country. So I sat there asking myself on that day in 2005, how could this have happened? So I started studying about it, the much I could get. And later on, after a few years, I went to the UK, and of course, because when I watched this movie, I was still living in Nigeria. It is hard to find Rwandans in Nigeria. I don't know what you know about Africa, but many times my fellow Africans here will confirm that we would rather pack our bags and come to Canada than pack our bags and go to Cameroon. Okay? So, but we do love Africa. Every African knows that the one thing that we have a heart for home. But we can also be very much itinerant people, that we would migrate to other places, make the place beautiful and wonderful, and then go home. But when I got to the United Kingdom, I made a lot of friends who were not Nigerians, but who were Africans. And some of them were Rwandans. And I started to ask them, just with this movie that had hurt me so much, I started to ask them about the genocide and how could it have happened? What happened? I know that most people know here, and I'm not here to talk about the Rwandan genocide because I know there's all kinds of dynamics behind it. But the long and short of it is that there were two main tribes in the country, the Hutus and the Tutsis. And so much had happened in between time, following colonization. Their colonial masters were the Belgians. But when the genocide started, just a handful of really bitter people from the Hutu tribe decided that they were going to exterminate every single one of the Tutsis. And also, they were going to exterminate any of the Hutus who were not willing to be with them, so otherwise the moderates. So the day the genocide started, they started to kill people. People took to the streets with their machetes, and they killed men, women, and children. My friends were telling me that even the pregnant women, there were strong instructions to get them and cut open their bellies and take out their children. So what had happened there, ladies and gentlemen, is that within this beautiful country, an ideology was formed. An ideology that was called the Hutu power. Wasn't shared by everybody, just a few people. And they developed this bitter ideology, which then triggered off, and they started the extermination of people. So, while it happened, within 100 days, the numbers have it that about 1 million people were killed. Within 100 days, 1 million people. Now, one thing that up to today I still cannot understand is how the world did not know that this was happening. It was in the news. This was in 94. I remember a few headlines from when I was in secondary school about Rwanda. But it was a piece of news that did not go viral, and it could have gone viral. Where were you in 1994? Where was I in 1994? When wicked people, a few wicked people took to the streets, and the other people who didn't want to be killed just remained pro-choice about it. So on the watch of the pro-choice and passive ones, innocent people were killed. 1 million innocent people. And the world remained distracted. Here are a few things that happened in 1994. And this is why it's so painful that anything so significant like 1 million people being killed, this is why it's so painful. In 1994, O.J. Simpson was charged to court. A lot of us were in the courtrooms with him through the televisions. If the gloves do not fit, you must acquit. I was 14, but I knew that line by head. And at that time, the Rwandans were being slaughtered. But we were instead more enthralled by the reality show that was the O.J. Simpson case. For those of us who felt a little bit, who were a bit more responsible, I'll say, than to follow that case like a reality TV show, you might have been distracted by the USA 94, which was the World Cup that many of us also watched. I'm Nigerian, so the World Cup means a lot to me. And in 94, we did really well in the World Cup, so we used to go out and actually watch these tournaments. So the World Cup continued while the genocide happened in Rwanda. For people who didn't follow the World Cup, in 1994, you might have watched another hit, this time from Disney, called The Lion King. All of us would have seen The Lion King in 94. And that was the year that 1 million people were killed. The ideology was formed that one group of people felt they were superior to another. They managed to dehumanize the people who were going to be killed. My friend said for a long time they were calling them cockroaches. On the radio shows, they would call them cockroaches. So when the genocide started, and the few activists went on the radio, they took to the airwaves, they were saying, kill the cockroaches. It's easier for one to kill another person if you do not think of them as a person. Now, I go from the story of Paul Rusesabagina to another story that has to do with human rights. The real life story that you may not have heard of a man called Solomon Northup. Solomon Northup was a free black man who was living in New York in 1840s. And that was the time of slavery, yes, but he was a free man. And then he went out once to D.C., and he was kidnapped in Washington, D.C. He was drugged, he was kidnapped, then he was sold into slavery because he's a black man. And then he was sold to somebody who was a planter in New Orleans in 1841. And this man's life quickly turned to hell. He was a slave who knew how to be free, who had been free before. So he resisted for so many years, and after many years, he was broken. Because many of us, of course, know the stories that came from slavery by the different memoirs out there. So he became a submissive slave in New Orleans and continued that way for more than a decade until sometime in 1852, he met a man that changed his life. He met a Canadian man, not just any man, a Canadian man. That was so significant because at the time, by 1852, this Canadian man came across him where he was working away as a slave. And he had just a few minutes to discuss with him. And by the time he had the discussions with the Canadian man, this Canadian man had absolutely no tolerance for slavery. You see, one thing that I have studied slavery quite a bit, but the one thing which I find so surprising is that Canada was actually so countercultural in fighting slavery. For the last century, Canada was a very difficult problem for slave owners because the Underground Railroad ended in Canada. Now, this man met Solomon Northup. His name was Samuel Baz, by the way, this Canadian brother of yours. And within a year, he helped Solomon Northup to gain back his freedom. He went against every law. He went against everything. He did everything he could, and he helped him to then become a free man. And the memoirs were written. And as usual, Hollywood then takes it and then makes a movie out of it called The 12 Years of Slavery. And they made billions of dollars out of it, as usual. But this is the one thing you have to tell Americans when you meet them, that as a Canadian, you are proud. Because Canada was countercultural about slavery. The Great Britain had in 1833, they had their Slavery Abolition Act due to the works of abolitionists like William Wilberforce. And they abolished slavery in Great Britain, 1833. The United States did not wake up to that until Abraham Lincoln passed the Proclamation Emancipation in 1863. But Canadians were so ahead of they actually were ahead of the times. Canadians passed an act called the Act Against Slavery in 1793. So you tell Americans you were 70 years before them in abolishing slavery. And you were 40 years even before the Great Britain. Canada was the first British colony to abolish slavery. By 1819, only a few years after Abraham Lincoln was born, you already had an attorney general who had decided and made a declaration that any black person that made it to Canada will be protected by law. Canada was the bastion of morality. Canada had a moral voice and spoke up, even when the rest of the world would not see the humanity of black people. And there, from the numbers, at least 100,000 slaves were freed just by stepping foot here in Canada. $100,000 black people found their freedom here. 100,000. That's a special number because it's also the number of babies aborted, unborn babies aborted in Canada every year. 100,000 babies every year. Canada has had legal abortion since 1969. Millions of babies have been killed. Women have been hurt. And Canada did it after the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom did it in 1967. Right now, I live in the UK. Before I came to the UK, I was living in Nigeria. I was born in Nigeria. I was raised in Nigeria. I worked in Nigeria in a hospital. And I came to the UK with the thought that I was already very exposed. I used to try to keep up with everything happening in the Western world. I watched movies. I watched sitcoms. I even watched Oprah show. Like every day. But honestly, when I came to the UK and realized that abortion was legal, that was the one thing that I wasn't prepared for. That was the one thing that I had no warning about. In all the Oprah show I watched, in all the sitcoms, in all the CNN news coverages, I never realized that there will ever be a country in this world, maybe except a communist country or something, but a Western world, a Western world that we saw as developed, where babies would be killed before they saw the light of day. It was a terrible shock for me. It was a horrible experience for me because I work in the hospital setting. So coming to the UK and then starting work at a hospital, and then realizing that in a hospital where babies were being born, at the same time, babies were being aborted. And it got me just questioning, where has this humanity gone to? But I stayed and I kept working, and I was always pro-life, so that was a terrible experience for me to get to realize that. But I never really got over it. And I kept waiting for an opportunity to get into the pro-life movement. And then the letter to Melinda Gates happened. And then I got into the pro-life movement. But then, even the more I studied about abortions in the Western world, the more shocking it was. Because where I come from, babies are cherished. When a woman has a baby, it doesn't matter how much money she has or doesn't have. People come out and start to dance, and they start to rejoice. So how is it that in a Western country, babies will be slaughtered like that? That nurses and doctors would go from being healers to killers? That women will be forced to actually willingly give themselves to abortionists for them to kill their children? That men will betray women when they get pregnant or take them to abortion clinics? All of this was a terrible shock for me. But in Canada, you have had, at this point, probably 4 million babies. I don't know what the latest numbers are, but 100,000 every year at least. Not only that, the government probably subsidizes it. In the UK, the government does a big subsidy, so abortions are almost free. But then, to realize a few weeks ago, even before this latest newspaper report, that Canada was going to take one step further to pay for abortions in developing countries. Canada that had been respected by different countries, developing countries, who had partnered with Canada. You had saved women's lives. Canada had given a lot of funding for maternal, newborn, child health care. Now the money is going to go to killing of the unborn in developing countries. That is terrible. That is shocking. So you begin to ask, will Canada then, at this point in time, 2016, become an exporter of abortion? Will the new Canadian government begin to pave the path to authentic development in Africa with the blood of the innocent? It is unacceptable. But also, this is what happens when, just like it has happened before, yes, it happened in Rwanda. Yes, it happened during the Holocaust. Yes, it happened with Armenians. Once an ideology is formed, radical feminism, women who decide, or even a society that decides that a woman's baby is not just a baby, it's a blob of tissues. Kind of sounds like those cockroaches, right? Every bit as barbaric. An ideology is formed. Dehumanization happens. Blob of tissue. It's not a baby. It's a choice. And then the extermination happens. Well, that is happening now. It's happening among you. But it's only a handful of people who are doing it. It's not everybody who is actively seeking abortion rights. Many doctors refuse to even do abortions. So still, a handful of doctors then go on to become abortionists. But the slaughter has continued in this country for 47 years, I would say, because of the rest of society who decide to be passive and pro-choice about it. But because this is Canada, and I know Canada as the country that abolished slavery even before Abraham Lincoln was born, to get old to do it in America. So you should reclaim your moral voice. Canada, reclaim your moral voice. Go back to 1793, pick it up. You had Attorney General who said by 1819, every black person should have the dignity and freedom to live in Canada, no matter where they've come from. You should be able to say today, every single baby conceived in Canada will be protected by law in Canada. You have been countercultural before. You can be countercultural again. Would it be painful? Yes. Would it cost you? Yes. But you are the great pro-life movement. And just walking side by side with amazing pro-life people, I know that you can help this country. You can help to redirect this country. so that the blood of the innocent will no longer be spilled among you. For every one baby killed in this country is one baby too much. It's one baby too many. Because unjust laws actually come and go all the time in human history. But the universal truths remain constant. And what is the universal truth in this case? It's that life begins at conception. There is no compromise. There should be no exception. Because Canadians who have walked before you did not know how to compromise when it came to slavery. They made no exceptions. They didn't know where to draw the line. For them, human rights was human rights. And for you today, human rights should be human rights. Every baby conceived in Canada should have the right to life. So Canada, I also have come to learn, having to prepare for this wonderful roast dinner, I've had to learn a lot, or a little, about the C-14. And I will not bore you with trying to get into the little I know of it, but as a lay person, looking from the outside, I believe that the C-14 might just be the sharp blade that Canada is right now playing with. And I believe it's dangerous. That euthanasia can never and should never be acceptable in any civilized society. We should not kill the generation before us or the generation after us. But the ideology which is pervasive, the ideology which has spread all the way to the United Nations, all the way to the most important institutions in the world, is that of a radical individualism. So it's just me. But the C-14 should not have a place in this society. And I would implore you, with this opportunity I have, to do everything you can to stop euthanasia from being a part of this country, or a part of your culture, or a part of your healthcare system. Because it will be steroids to the culture of death, which has already come in with abortion. And it should be stopped at all costs. When the Rwandan genocide was happening, the one thing that happened, really did happen, is that the people who were being killed, exterminated, slaughtered, they had one cry. They looked to other African countries, they looked to other African nations, and they cried, "End the killing. End the killing." It has been said before, but the other African nations were too distracted or too busy with their own different problems. They looked to the colonial nation, Belgium, and they cried to Belgium, "Please end the killing." But Belgium didn't do that much to help them. They looked to powerful Western nations, and they begged and cried, "End the killing." But we were too busy watching O.J. Simpson and his case and the World Cup and Lion King. They looked to the United Nations and cried, "End the killing." Well, the UN did send some of their people, but they really didn't do that much. They looked towards United States and asked this powerful president called Bill Clinton, and they cried to Bill Clinton, "Please end the killing." And up to today, this is one thing that even he has admitted that it's one of the biggest mistakes that he ever did, because Bill Clinton did not end the killing. And so 1 million people fell, 70% of an entire tribe wiped out from the face of the earth. This is 2016. So I'll just end by speaking in the language of 2016, which is just a language of hashtags. I'll say hashtag stop abortion, hashtag no to euthanasia, hashtag end the killing. Dear people of Canada, dear church and religious leaders, dear politicians, dear ladies and gentlemen, yes, we are all ordinary people. And yes, I know that we are outnumbered, greatly outnumbered in this battle, especially in a Western country like Canada. But we can really rise up and fight to end the killing in this country. We can put in more effort. You're doing so much already. We can pray more. We can give more. We can dedicate more of our lives to the pro-life movement. But we must end this, and we must end this soon. Because abortion is claiming too many lives. Because abortion is destroying too many families. Because in the timeline of history, abortion is causing so much wound just on the beautiful skin of history. And one day in the future, it might not even be that long, because Rwanda was only 20 plus years ago. But one day in the future, people will ask us, where were we? What were we doing when 100,000 babies were being aborted in Canada? If euthanasia comes here, people will ask us, where were we when C-14 was paraded as a good thing? But we have to be those ones who have the moral voice to say that we were the ones that fought right to the end. We were the ones that kept the faith. We were the ones that made the sacrifice. We were the ones that did not drop the ball. We were the ones that did everything what we needed to, and everything we could to bring the slaughter to an end. Because history has repeated itself so many times, and here it is again. It is the culture of death, but we are the people of life. And we herald the gospel of life. And we can bring it right to this battle. We can bring everything we have to this battle. And with the help of God, we can be countercultural, and we can indeed end the killing. Thank you.